Hey guys, it's the Sad Knight here, and we're back with another episode of the Legend of Vox Machina Season 3, All Spells Breakdown. Alright, let's get into it. First one, of course, is Keyleth. She's a level 16 moon druid. The first one we see, of course, is her wild shape into the goldfish. This is a reference to an iconic moment in the original stream where she transformed into a goldfish and then sadly bit the dust. Of course, we have the classic tiger, which she calls Minxie. We also see, of course, an example of her transforming actually through the transition stage of Keyleth into the hawk in this moment. I really like that. But of course, this is her wild shape into her hawk, her probably most used transformation in the animated series. We, of course, see her wild shape fire elemental. The reason she can do the elemental forms is actually because of her moon druid subclass. We also see that the next wild shape she got in this season is her earth elemental. And so really hyped that now we have two of her elemental forms in the animated series. The earth elemental is really good. After that, we have an example of holding a spell. We actually had a couple of these examples in this season, which I really like, as everybody else preps their different spells and abilities. She just has an example of her hands glowing, but we don't know what spell she's potentially about to cast here, so it's just a quick example of her holding a spell. Right here we have a quick moment where her hand glows, and then all of the braziers end up lighting on fire, which of course druidcraft can light and extinguish torches and stuff like that, so wouldn't be too far off to say that this is the cantrip druidcraft. Right after that, we have an example of a first level Burning Hands. It's the closest fire level projectile spell I could find in the druid category. Druids usually directly from the fingers, although directly from the palm of the hand is not too much of an artistic change. Right here we see several examples of this spell. This is the second level spell, Gust of Wind. She uses it to push enemies away up to potentially 15 feet or more, and we also see an example of it being able to extinguish a flame. Right here, of course, we have a combo ability. This is, of course, the arrow is a bramble shot merged with what appears to be possibly a plant growth, as this arrow strikes into the enemy and releases the bramble shot, we see it expand into and grow into a tree, which of course plant growth can help extend vegetation's growth. Seems like it's a pretty close comparison right here. Of course, we have a perfectly easy example, third level Speak with Plants, as she uses this to talk with the Sun Tree. We have the third level Daylight spell. This one is the hardest, one of the hardest ones in the series. There was actually a lot of good examples of hard spells to figure out in this season. However, this was some type of message, possibly ascending. However, of course, most of those are in your head, not verbally out loud. There's also a message through animals, but there's not really a good example of message through plants or environment. If not, there should be one, obviously. But Matt Mercer and them at the roundtables actually talked about how this was just kind of a customized type of spell, and it really wasn't necessarily drawn directly from a specific one. So I backtracked off of my original assumption for this spell and just classified it as a possible third level sending with question mark, because it seems to be just heavily modified sending or some type of communication. I can't really tie this. We have an example of her fourth level Grasping Vine. We have a fifth level Commune with Nature. This is also one of the round table that did speak about how she was basically in commune with nature itself. This obviously has some artistic liberties about it. There's a little bit more of an extension. Usually commune with nature only communes with your general environment, and she's obviously connecting to the entire planet and to all the threads and the ley lines and stuff, so they've definitely expanded where this spell was at. Since it's a customized interpretation of it, if in actuality it would be like a way higher upticked version, obviously. Right here we have an example of Contagion. Of course, this is her transferring the disease that was inside of Raishan back into Raishan, but one of the examples of the Contagion spell is the Rot Flesh feature, and so this is a perfect example of the flesh just rotting away from the new Draco Lich Thordak Raishan combo. Right here we have an example of her casting Wall of Thorns. Right here we have an example of her casting Wall of Stone. We also see an example of her doing the Wall of Ice. Right here you can actually put the Wall of Ice, or any of the walls really, into a cylindrical fashion. So basically she is just circling Thordak with all of the, well, Draco Lich Thordak with a bunch of ice, so they're all sticking into him. And instead of having it where he's moved out of the way, since he's a gargantuan creature, he's just kind of stuck in and impaled, instead of course, usually if you're inside the wall, you get pushed outside the wall. In this case, he obviously can't. We have an example of Move Earth. As you see, several different boulders just move out of the way of Grog and Scanlan. We have a Find the Path, so much more lower level, although a higher level spell, but much more lower level expression of a spell that helps you find where you're trying to go, like we were seeing with that Commune with Nature to find Raishan. This one just simply is trying to find the exact location of the Ziggurat, and all of a sudden a couple vines move away, and then bam, there's the location. We also see, of course, our continuous examples of the Transport via Plant spell. This is an iconic one she's used many times, especially through the Sun Tree to other locations, and we've seen this in other seasons. Next we got Pike Trickfoot. She's a level 16 cleric of the War Domain. The first feature we're actually going to see from her is from the Plate of the Dawn Martyr, which of course is just the rebuke feature where basically it can absorb and repel fire blasts. We see an example of just a simple Cure Wounds. We see an example right here, actually, interestingly enough, of the ceremony's atonement feature, where they try to redeem a soul. This was actually used in Calamity to try and redeem a powerful betrayer god. Won't go into too much detail about that, just in case people haven't seen Calamity. But since we actually ran into a Calamity character in this season, I think it's a fun little homage to that moment where he tried to use that spell. So she's trying to redeem a soul in hell right here. Of course, right here we have the first level spell, Shield of Faith. Next, we have Gentle Repose. This is a spell that prevents your body from decaying, giving your players enough time to eventually come back and resurrect them. However, in this moment, we see here that the body is actually being rejuvenated from decay, which is not how the spell originally works. However, that's probably just some artistic liberty. Next spell we got, of course, is the second level Spiritual Weapon. Obviously, same kind of thing. She creates the Spiritual Weapon, but instead of floating independently of her, she actually wields it like an actual weapon. I love that feature for her. Right here we have the 5th level spell Scry. Her eyes light up, and she usually can perceive into the next person's location. She's used the spell a couple of different times. This right here is the 5th level spell Commune. Of course, every now and again, she just starts praying, and next thing you know, she gets into this like higher plane of existence kind of thing, where she usually ends up getting feedback from her deity. We saw a lot of this in previous seasons. This right here, of course, is very interesting. So this moment right here could be a lesser restoration because it looks like they're affected by some type of fear toxin, and lesser restoration actually will cure conditions. However, none of those conditions are the fear condition. And greater restoration, which is the one I went with in this moment just because it seems like it's more impactful of a moment than for lesser. But greater restoration will help with a debilitating effect. And this seems like it's debilitating them because they're obviously struck in this hallucinogenic fear moment. However, the actual breakdown of what those conditions are, the major conditions are like charm and paralyzation is the other one. And this clearly, neither of those are fear either. So it's really kind of an up in the air thing. I think this is just an example of artistic liberty where she's trying to cure a condition, and so it's a type of restoration, whether this is actually lesser or greater. But of course, neither of these spells 100% hit that condition, so they're just kind of taking up a leeway step, not a big deal. But what's interesting is after it doesn't work, we get this moment right here where she uses, like, I guess her blood or something, and she kind of uses her own power internally to basically cast the same effect. But of course, now it has this reddish tone and almost these cindering embers that come off of it, kind of like representing a hell type feature, because now she's moving away from her god and more towards herself, more of a hedonistic behavior because that demon dude kind of convinced her to do so. All I can say is this is just like the same spell, just reinterpreted based off of a different way of casting it from oneself rather than a deity. Right here, of course, we have a 5th level example of Raised Dead. Interestingly enough, that I originally placed this as Resurrection, and either spell would generally work in this situation. The only reason I want to put it as Raised Dead here is because with Raised Dead, the creature comes back with 1 HP, and with Resurrection, they come back with full HP. And Percy even looks like he's really messed up, and that's usually an example of Raised Dead anyways, is they usually come back with some negative feedback. They have, I think, a couple negative counters on some of their ability checks and stuff like that for a while, and it has to go away over time. He even talks about basically if you hug him too much, he's gonna like re-die again. Next right here, I think this is actually an homage to a waste of a very powerful spell on something simple and frivolous. Regeneration is a 7th level spell, and it can regenerate a limb, but it does not actually specify hair. No real spell that heals you actually refers to healing your hair, obviously. You could say it's just a simple cure, like wounds or something like that could rejuvenate your hair or something, but the only reason I'm going to say it's regenerate is because actually in the one-shot Search for Grog, which I won't go into details of because I hope they actually do an animated movie of it here soon for any of you guys who haven't seen the stream, but basically there is a moment where Keyleth has to waste a 7th level spell of regeneration off of a gimmicky little fun moment that the guys joked about in the stream, and then they flipped a coin for it in the one shot and it became a real thing. And so she's like, over a joke, I had to waste a 7th level spell slot on nothing. I think that's what this actually is here, is it's instead of it just being a focus on the fact that she casted a spell, I think it's actually more of a reference to that moment of wasting powerful magic over frivolous things. And that's why I think this is the 7th level spell Regenerate. Next up we have Scanlan Shorthall, a level 16 Bard, College of Lore. So the first thing we notice with Scanlan actually is an example of concentration being broken, and I love this moment because basically one of the undead screeches and he struggles because it's hurting his ears. He struggles to maintain his form and he actually loses concentration and drops the spell. However, the spell that I suggest that it is, of course, does not actually have concentration, so that would just be some artistic liberty taken here. Next we have his iconic 3rd level spell Lightning Bolt, which of course he calls Dick Lightning, as he always casts it from his pelvis. And of course right here we have an example of the 5th level spell Scry being actually casted from his vestige, Myth Carver, instead of course directly from him. This is showing Odan Sur, an example of the person looking for, which is the actual criminal, so it kind of scries on Ripley. Right here we have his iconic Big B's Hand, which he of course calls Scanlan Hand. It's a 5th level spell. Right here we have an example of his 5th level spell Seeming. This was a spell that he actually used way back in the beginning of the campaign to disguise them as cows. There's actually tons tons of references to the cows actually in season 1, and that's what he originally used and what he usually uses when he's disguising him and his teammates, and so that's kind of why I went with this spell right here, because that's what he's doing, is he's disguising his teammates as demons, and seeming would generally work for this moment. However, the breaking of the concentration is odd because of course seeming doesn't have concentration. However, that could just be a little bit of artistic liberty. This is the 7th level spell, Magnificent Mansion. Of course, this is Scanlan Short Hall's version of the Magnificent Mansion, which of course has Ghost that only creates chicken. Next we have Grog Strongjaw, a level 16 barbarian berserker / fighter subclass weapon master. But first off, of course, we have his feature Rage, and we saw an example of his feature Frenzied Rage. We get to see this once in a while when he goes into a Frenzied Rage. Since his subclass is Berserker, he gets a alternative form of Rage, and whenever you see that in the animation, you'll see that his eyes actually go completely white and blank out, and of course, he gets a much more intense exaggeration when he rages here. Of course, the spell that Grog gets to kind of cast is a feature from his Vestige, the Titanstone Knuckles, which of course is just the 2nd level spell Enlarge, which is part of the Large and Reduce spell, but of course, his Titanstone Knuckles can only cast the Enlarge feature. Next we have Vex'ahlia, a level 16 rogue subclass assassin, paladin subclass Oath of Vengeance. Of course, we see his feature from his Blinkback belt, which of course lets him return his blades to his hands after he's thrown them. And of course, I'm just referring to the feature as return. It doesn't actually have a feature name, but that generally works here. We see an example of the 3rd level spell Haste, which was originally a part of his Boots of Haste that he had in the original series, but of course, for the animated series, they decided to switch it to the Deathwalker's Ward, and so it's part of his Vestige now. Of course, right here we see another Deathwalker Ward feature, which is the ability for him to sprout wings and fly. So generally, even though I think it's just a feature of the armor, it's the 3rd level spell Fly for all intents and purposes. We also see an example of some spells that are not really, I guess this would also be an extension of the Deathwalker's Ward for him, his connection to his god, or even from his religious point of view. Obviously, he doesn't himself have a lot of these spells, and sometimes they're even potentially being casted by the Raven Queen. I'll go into more detail with that in the next spell. But of course, we see a 5th level example of Commune, where he's communing with his deity. And then the last one here, we actually have a example of the 9th level spell Future Sight, which is awesome. A lot of people were getting upset about this, talking about how he needs to be touched by the spell and stuff like that. I believe that this is being casted from the Raven Queen herself onto him because of his connection as her champion, which means I don't think a deity needs to directly touch you. They're always kind of spiritually with you kind of vibe. But what's really cool about this spell is it's also another homage to a moment in the original stream. Later on, actually, what we're going to hopefully see an example of in season 4 against an enemy that I won't go into too much detail about. Keyleth actually does cast this spell on him right before a battle, and then a bunch of crazy stuff goes down, and he gets to see the battle as it's happening, and some stuff goes down. I won't go into it, but it's a really cool moment, and we get an example of it right here where he constantly keeps getting to see glimpses of the future, which the Foresight is a concept of seeing glimpses of the future. Usually not this far ahead of possible futures and horrible outcomes, but since we're assuming that this is possibly just an expression of this being casted from the Raven Queen, artistic liberty, deity level stuff easily can break the restrictions on the spell, no problem there. But it's fun that this is a nice little homage to that moment, especially with the key. Of course, if we're going to mention Vex'ahlia, we got to mention his sister, Vex'ahlia. Level 16, Ranger, subclass Beastmaster, Rogue, subclass Assassin. First thing, of course, her feature Primal Awareness. Her head hurt basically whenever she's around her favorited enemy, which is the ones that she wants to kill the most, which is dragons. And of course, this is an arc all about dragons, so it went off tons of times. We see an example of Fenthris's bow ability, the Bramble Shot, which of course, once it shoots an arrow, it releases a bunch of tangled vines that hold your enemy. Also, of course, we see an example of the Blazing Bowstring, which she originally had on multiple different bows, and then basically she tied it to Fenthris later on. So then from then on, Fenthris had this ability, which allows her to shoot fire arrows. And then of course, we see an example of her shooting lightning arrows. Next, we have an example of Percival Frederickstein von Musel Kowalski de Rollo III. He's a level 16 fighter subclass gunslinger. The only major feature that I'm gonna go over here, we do see several examples of his multi-attack feature and a couple other things in here, but the one I want to focus on, of course, is the charge feature of diplomacy. This, of course, is the feature from Diplomacy, which is, of course, when he builds up a series of charges and then releases an electrical attack on his opponents. Next, we have an example of one of Percy's trick shots, the headshot, which seemed to knock Vorugal prone in this moment. Next, of course, we have Sean Gilmore, a beloved NPC who's easily level 16 plus. Of course, his class is Sorcerer, subclass Runechild, which is a unique one built by Matt Mercer. All of his stats are unknown. Spells that we see, the first one I'm going to talk about is, of course, a moment where he starts to channel up and build up a spell, but then he gets stopped. He gets grappled by a magical item. So this spell's unknown. I don't have enough details to exactly know what it is. Most of the spells on Gilmore's list are illusion spells or defensive type spells. There's only a couple attack spells that are way bigger than this, so I can't tell exactly what he was trying to do here. Probably was some type of illusion, maybe to distract and deter the enemies, but I don't think he was going to put up anything major. But of course, since he stopped mid-cast, I can't tell you what it is. Right here we see an example of the magical item. His fan allows him to seemingly cast the first level spell Disguise Self. From there, of course, we have an example of the second level spell Pyrotechnics. This one took a while, not gonna lie. When I first saw this, I was like, what is this spell? Is this just some magical item fun shenanigans? And then I looked it up and I found out there's basically a spell called Pyrotechnics that releases some type of firework-like effect. And since Percy Dohla shoots this from his gun and it blasts up a giant G up in the air to distract the enemies, I'm gonna assume because it was a big firework that this is Pyrotechnics. Of course, we have an example of the 5th level spell Wall of Force. We see a lot of Wall of Forces in this season. Next, we have an example of the 7th level spell Teleport. We see a couple examples of this from several casters as well. There are several different teleport spells out there in the game. However, several of them have different limitations. So with this one, you can have an 8-player max. Vox Machina's team is 7, plus the caster who's helping them get there makes 8. Next, of course, we have Allura Visorin. She's a 16 plus level NPC, with her class being Wizard and her subclass being Abjuration. Same thing, since she's one of Matt's NPCs. We actually don't know what her actual stats are, but she does get to show up and show off in this season. We get another wonderful moment of just seeing an example of her holding a spell just like Keyleth was doing. Her hands are glowing. She's obviously ready to release a spell because she's looking for Vorugal to show up and attack them. Next, we see an example of the cantrip Firebolt. This is a simple low-level fire projection spell that she shoots over at Pike to see if her vestige works. Next, we see an example of the Great Water spell. We see a quick and easy example of the 2nd level spell Misty Step, as right here Allura just really quickly disappears and reappears from where she was to right next to Percy. Right here, this was an interesting one. So this is originally I said it was the 2nd level spell Earthbind. In the last season, it was Earthbind for sure. The color was actually yellow, and it attacked a creature that was flying and dropped it to the ground, dropping its fly speed to 0, which thanks to the community for helping me realize that. With this spell, my first reaction was to say that this is also still Earthbind because it's the same lashy design, but it's blue instead of yellow. And it has a pull feature to it where it can actually just drag the enemy around a little bit. And these are creatures that aren't necessarily flying. She does use this against Vorugal too, but he's at the moment also not flying. So this appears the same as the Earthbind spell from the previous season. However, it is slightly different. And so I'm not exactly sure. There are tons of different spells out there, but to find a sorcerer spell that has a whip-like feature can be difficult. So for right now, I'm keeping it listed as Earthbind, but because I wasn't able to find anything potentially better to replace it. However, honestly, this spell could be something else very easily. Right here, we see a really quick moment of what at first I thought was possibly the Expeditious Retreat spell, but I believe it's actually the Haste spell. So in this moment, she starts to blur out, and then the enemy comes down and crashes onto her. She actually shifts out of the way, giving her like this really quick, fast movement response and stuff like that. Of course, Haste, it boosts your dexterity and boosts your movement speed. However, what Haste also does is give you an additional action. Right after this moment, she actually casts 2 spells in the time that it takes her opponent to cast 1. She does like 2 energy blasts back to back, kind of showing a little bit of a reference to taking 2 actions instead of 1 on the following time it's her turn because she's hasted. So with that little homage and the fact that this quick little dodge move, I'm going to assume that this little blur out moment is her casting haste on herself. Right here we have the 5th level spell Wall of Force again being used. We saw this in several other seasons as well. Allura did this one quite a bit. Same thing, big ethereal barrier that seems to block physical objects from entering, and of course being used in a defensive manner. In this same scene, she actually right afterwards combos it with a teleportation spell. We also get to see that it can be used in unorthodox manners. It can be created as, of course, a spherical dome, and there's nothing that really says you can't put it upside down. And so that's kind of a fun little, like, not even just an artistic liberty here, but a fun creative way to potentially use a spell that we didn't really think about. I don't know if it could be used like this, but I kind of want to run it like that in my games. Of course, we see examples of the 7th level spell Teleport. Same thing here. Actually, what's really cool here is because Vox Machina's group is 7 players, plus usually 1 caster makes 8 players for the Teleport, but they have 9 people here because there's Kima as well. But Scanlan backs out and goes to go talk to his daughter and try to run into his daughter in this moment. So we still only have 8 players. So it's like a subtle little like acknowledgement of there was too many people for the teleportation, so one person had to dip out, and Scanlan dipped out to go see his family. So it's kind of a really nice little subtle nod there if you're really familiar with some of the mechanics. So I'm still going to say this is a 7th level spell, teleportation. Next we have Kima of Vord. Her class is Paladin, subclass Oath of the Devotion. First feature we see, of course, is the Divine Smite. I just refer to it as Smite in this image. But right here is interestingly enough, at first I thought this might be a Searing Smite, being a representation of it like traveling across the ground, the Smite-like feature. But then I looked at the spells a little bit, and I found a 5th level Destructive Wave. Destructive Wave actually goes in a radial in all directions. However, you can choose who to hit and who not to hit with it. So she can validate that Allura is an ally, don't hit her with it, and so it only needs to artistically show in the direction of the enemies it's actually hitting here. So that's just kind of an artistic liberty, but it is a wave of divine energy that rushes forward and hits all the enemies within a certain radius. And so this is possibly an example of the destructive wave. Next, of course, we have Cerkonos, a level 20 druid, Circle of the Moon. The only stats I found for him were level 20, and these were the stats. They are most likely the recent updated stats. In campaign 3, Robbie's playing this character. However, I found it on the wiki with some of the old artwork and stuff like that, so it could be that these are his old stats and Robbie's going off them, but it's probably Robbie's stats. So at this moment in the history of Vox Machina, he could easily be lower level than this. We only see him cast a couple spells as part of an allied nation of the Ashari and a couple other individuals from other nations who teamed up to fight Thordak. We see cantrips, dancing light. Originally I just said light and I was wrong. People called it out. These are multiple globules of light that are moving separated from any object or surface, like the light spell usually would work. And then of course we have the second level spell, Gust of Wind, being casted by Cerkonos. Same thing. He uses it to actually push out all of the dirt and debris that's kind of like in the air. Same perfect example of what the sub little options are of Gust of Wind. We see a possible example of the 5th level spell, Wall of Force again. This is casted by multiple people kind of overlaying them. It's ethereal type barrier of force-like energy that of course is blocking their attacks. Usually the walls are pretty simple to determine, like Wall of Vines is vines, ice is ice, earth is earth, fire is fire. So when you see like energy or magic, it's usually Wall of Force. It's the easiest one to go with right here, and it's usually correct. Next we have Korrin, a level 16 plus-ish type druid of the Circle of the Moon. Same thing, NPC, don't know his stats. He is Keyleth's father from the Ashari, and we see an example of him using what I believe is possibly the cantrip druidcraft. At one point I thought this might be the same thing, kind of plant growth, kind of regenerating and rejuvenating nature, but also plant growth can be used to kind of do that too on smaller scales with plants. And it also talks about having flowers bloom. This flower is heavily wilted, so obviously he had to do a little bit more to that, but it does bloom into a nice beautiful flower again, so I'm gonna assume that it's druidcraft sub-feature, the blooming flowers. Next we have Kashaw, a level 13 at the time of his original first appearance in the stream. Don't know what level he's at now. I'm assuming he'd be close to Vox Machina's level by now, but he is a cleric of the life domain. We see him cast a perfect example of the 2nd level spell, Spiritual Weapon. Same thing that happens with Pike. He actually uses it like a weapon, so he creates a spear, he throws a spear, bam. This one right here was a lot of controversy. A lot of people argued between the concepts of both the Spirit Guardians that I first called it as and Blade Barrier. It was hard to say because obviously these are divine energy things that are circling around him, which Blade Barrier could do, and definitely, of course, Spirit Guardians can do. You can make your Spirit Guardians look like weapons if you want, realistically. However, they projectile away from him and shoot into the enemy, and that's the biggest difference here. So this could just be artistic liberty here, and especially because when you walk into the space of an enemy, they do attack that enemy. So this could just be an example of because he ends up right point blank with Thordak later on in this scene, and so obviously he is moving closer to Thordak. So this could just be an example of him taking the damage as he's moving into his space. However, as Blade Barrier works like at one of the walls, you can stack them in the same spot as the enemy, and so it could be that them circling around him was just him prepping the casting, showing that he was like what he was conjuring, and then afterwards these things all shooting into Thordak's space is an example of him choosing where to place the spell. So once he's casted it, he's going, this is actually the point of contact that the blade of barriers are going to appear, and so now they're all shooting to the location that they need to go into, which is within Thordak's space. So with thinking of it like that, of a narrative reason why the spell could be either or, I like Blade Barrier better for it being, I initiated my cast and now I'm choosing the location and you're within its space, and so they're all going to pummel into you, more than I like the idea of I cast this spell and then this is them attacking you as I'm entering your space. Both kind of work, but I think Blade Barrier works a little bit better, especially because it does also have that blade-like weapon element to it, and some commenters were talking about that too. So I love the feedback. Thank you guys for that. So as far as I can tell, this is the 6th level spell, Blade Barrier. Zahra, when she was first appeared in the series, she was level 13 as well. We don't know what her current updated level stats would look like, so I'm not going to mess with that. She was a warlock with a subclass of the Great Old One, Patron. Of course, we see an example of her cantrip, Eldritch Blast. You gotta get an example of Eldritch Blast with a warlock. And we see a 1st level spell, Floating Disc. Some people argued with this one as well, and I do understand why, because you can't ride the floating disc. However, this is also another example of artistic liberty. We see her use the floating disc in a previous season, and she uses it like an elevator to go up and down while she's on it. You shouldn't be able to do that. But most players have, for fun or in attempts, have tried to ride their disc before. It's happened in D&D games before. So I'm assuming that this artistic liberty is also associating with the reference of how players have tried to ride their floating disc or get some shenanigans. Oh, my buddy rides it and I move along because he's not me. Vice versa, what type situation. There's always somebody trying to hack floating disc, and so I think this is just an example of kind of getting to have that fun of breaking the rules on the disc right here. Right here we have what appears to be an example of the 3rd level spell, Glyph of Warding. I know some people were suggesting that this could be another spell, but from what I can tell, the best option right here is it's a giant glyph, and the glyphs, when triggered, can explode. So it's a giant glyph, and it blows up just like a Glyph of Warding would. What's really funny though, of course, is that Glyph of Warding takes an hour to cast, and so I just can't imagine a Zahra behind this wall just chilling here for an hour trying to cast this sigil just to blow it up so she could have a cool entrance in the big war. That's kind of funny to think about. But besides that, I think also some people said that this spell, or possibly even the disc as well, weren't actually on the warlock lists. But of course, Zahra is actually a Pact of the Tome, and of course it takes a little bit of liberty because she does get access to spells from other people's lists, although they're usually about cantrip first level. I think she gets access to a couple rituals as well. It wouldn't take much of a leap artistically to say that she could just have higher level spells in another category. Besides that, of course, with the rules, if I run out of possible options of what the spell could be on their general class, I'll go to any spell that feasibly looks like the spell, and this does appear to be a Glyph of Warding. Of course, I could be wrong. Next, of course, we have Ripley, one of the bad guys. The only stats I found for her was her bad guy stats of a level 20 fighter, subclass gunslinger, with also being a wizard, subclass unknown. She does not have all her stats revealed on her crit roll stats, but she does have a few things, including her strength, her wisdom, her AC, and her HP. We see her use a couple different features throughout the game. Of course, with her Cabal's Ruin vestige, she uses the feature Rebuke, where of course Cabal's Ruin can absorb and redirect spells that are sent at it. We do see an example of what possibly could be a 2nd level spell, Invisibility. She goes invisible, she walks behind Percy, then she tries to move and take an action on Percy, so then it breaks the invisibility and she goes right back to being visible again. That's very possibly what happened in this scene, not 100%. We also see another example of that where she does the same kind of artistic design of when she goes invisible, but she seems to like rapidly move and shift to a different point, almost semi-sporadically. This is possibly a 3rd level spell, Blink. As you do blink in and out of existence, you're phasing through to the ethereal plane, and you can move a couple feet and then you reappear again, and so on and so forth. And so it's usually sporadic, it's usually hard to control. She might have had full control of it in this moment narratively. That's an artistic liberty in that case, but it does kind of function how I would assume the blink spell would work in animation. Of course, next we have Dohla. I don't know her level or any of her stats as well. She's another NPC made by Matt Mercer. However, what's interesting is I think she's actually replacing a pivotal character in Vox Machina who had a moment here, and I won't go into too much detail, of course, because this is a discussion over Orin, the 8th player of Critical Role, who left right at the beginning of the Briarwood arc over controversy with the rest of the group, and he played the 8th member of Vox Machina, who was a sorcerer dragonborn named Tiberius, and he was a red-scaled dragonborn. He went to Draconia to talk to his family, and when they showed up in this ice area, instead of finding this dragon lady to help them guide them along the way to hell, they actually found the corpse of Tiberius, signaling the last little bit of acknowledgement that they had of him in the series before completely moving away from him altogether. Well, what's interesting is, of course, this woman seems to, this dragoness seems to operate in the similar spellcasting fashion as him. He was a sorcerer. She seems to kind of behave as a sorcerer as well. And so one of the spells I'm going to get to here in a minute actually is going to be the reason why I bring this up. We do see an example of a cantrip, Create Bonfire. She just lights a little bonfire here. We see a cantrip that also is possibly the Firebolt spell, shooting just a quick fire blast out of her hand. We see an example of her casting a shield to block Kima's strike right here, which is the 1st level spell. Shield. Someone brought this up, and I do agree with them. This right here could also be an example of the 1st level spell Jump, just being reflavored as her boosting herself up with her fire powers, but of course gives her an extra jump, kind of extra leap in the air. So could be just a cool reflavoring of the jump spell, could not. We see an example of what's possibly the 2nd level spell, Misty Step. She was up at that ridge line, and now she's down by Vorugal. And of course, whenever you see the rush of energy around them, that's flavored differently depending on the caster. For her, it's fire. Around them, it's usually some type of example of the misty element of Misty Step. We see an example of what looks like her dispelling magic. It appears that this rock face is actually an illusion, and she's breaking the illusion by using 3rd level spell Dispel Magic, as it literally looks like it vaporizes the rock that appeared to have illusionary substance to it. Right here we have the 4th level spell Glacial Blast. From what I can tell online, this is only something from Critical Role and was specifically used by Tiberius, the sorcerer from their group, who was a dragonborn as well, and it shoots a blast of ice that actually leaves chunks of ice on their opponents and kind of like semi-stuns them for a round. And you can see that with Kima right here. She's got a chunk of ice on her face and she was knocked to the ground and basically lost a turn in combat. And so I think that this is actually a reference to the Glacial Blast spell. So I think it's actually a weird little like secret homage to Tiberius right here, that there was of course a dragonborn character in this moment, but it wasn't Dohla. Right here, this one was quite difficult. I originally gave it was Erupting Earth. It was the closest spell I could find at the time because it was like cracking the ground around you type thing. But that kind of burst up from the ground. And looking at higher level spells, overlooked Earthquake at the time because it just seemed like it wasn't correct. But the structure category, I was thinking of buildings and I shouldn't have. This rock face can count as a structure to a certain degree, and it breaking apart and having rubble fall on them from above does make sense. And I think I judged this one a little too quickly. And so from the debris falling from above kind of thing and thinking of the structure, the rock face as a structure like a building would be, I think that this makes a lot more sense. That this is the 8th level spell, Earthquake. Of course, somebody called me on this one as well, and I appreciate that. I jumped the gun a little too quick because I was like, it's arcane energy. It's a big gate. And I look at it and it's like, it connects 2 points. And I was like, ah, cool. It's the arcane gate spell, and I was totally wrong. I didn't look at the actual duration and the fact that it goes through 2 different planes of existence. This appears to be the 9th level spell gate, which does let you connect one point to another between 2 planes of existence. I love that in this moment that they actually need 2 casters to cast this spell. I think that's showing that certain spells are so powerful it can't be done by one alone. Is really cool. Next, of course, we have Yenk. Yenk is a goristro, a fiend demon. Was originally actually in the original stream. He was actually charmed by Scanlan into fighting Vorugal. And this one, of course, they just have him run into him from hell. We see one major feature from him, which is the disintegration ray, which seems, of course, like the disintegration ray you would see from a beholder. A beam shoots out, and it seems to destroy and devastate everything in its area. Traditionally, the Yenk did not originally have this spell, but of course, artistic liberty, they could just add the spell to the creature because it's cool. Next, of course, we have his opponent, Vorugal the Frigid Doom, a ancient white dragon. The major feature we see of this dragon, of course, is his breath weapon, which is an ice blast, which it's interesting is he uses it as like little pock shots. He just shoots individual like little globules that hit down and release crystals of ice instead of having just a traditional breath like weapon where he breathes it out. He just kind of like spits it out, which I really love for him. Next, of course, we have Thordak, the Cinder King, an ancient red dragon, whose, of course, body has been amplified to gargantuan levels with the soul gem. Right here, we see an example of the damage immunity to fire. Of course, lava does fire damage, and traditionally dragons for the most part are resistant to their element. Sometimes they're immune, especially if they're older, but of course, since he's amplified with that gem, I would say that this moment here is definitely a perfect example of it. Right here, of course, we see an example of his breath weapon of fire, and of course right here we see an example of his special, unique for the animation breath weapon, which the fan base has dubbed the atomic breath weapon, as it is a nice homage to Godzilla. He charges up a big blue flame blast out of his mouth. Next we have Raishan, the Diseased Deceiver, an ancient green dragon. We see her feature change shape. This is a feature usually found on older metallic dragons, not usually chromatic dragons. However, Matt Mercer even acknowledged himself in the streams that taking pieces from other dragons and mixing and matching for your own fun makes a lot of sense. And especially if you want to have a dragon as a villain, have them stealthily disguised as a human makes sense. So this is just a feature where they can disguise themselves as humans. Of course, we have Raishan's breath weapon, which is poison. We have an example of her Dracolich Thordak form breath weapon, which appears to be necrotic fire. Obviously, since it's an undead body, I'm assuming the decayed nature of it made it have a necrotic element. In this moment, Raishan actually even says to Pike when she tries to absorb it, it's not quite fire, which means from my perception, I would assume that it still is fire, but a little bit different. So necrotic fire would make sense in this moment. We see an example of her casting the first level spell Shield to block a fire blast. We see an example of her casting what appears to be the Gust of Wind spell as it knocks Grog, who's a very large and heavy creature, over by about 15 feet away from the rest of the group as he's knocked back. We see an example of her having same thing, solo teleportation, a lot of mist around. She could easily have just dipped a few feet away and nobody would ever know. It could be a bigger level spell, teleportation as well, but it could possibly be just an example of a nice little second level misty step. We see an example of the second level spell Hold Person as Vex'ahlia is just trapped in midair in front of her. We see the third level spell Major Image, as you know, some images cannot produce sound or move. This one actually can. It moves around and it produces little sound elements, which is why I would believe that this is a major image, not a minor illusion. Right here we have a possible example of the fourth level spell Blight. So at first some people have given me resistance on this, and I totally understand why. The reason I would say that this is Blight, on top of the disease-esque type nature of it, of course, it talks about absorbing moisture out of the body. And in this moment right here with the blood vessels like struggling right there on the sides of her eyes, possible that it's robbing her body of some moisture. It also, of course, is choking her out in general, so that could be why her eyes are like that. Kind of hard to completely determine what this spell is. There's several spells that have mentioned robbing you of the air from your lungs. It could also be one of those. So this one's not 100%, but appears to be Blight. There's a fifth level spell, Teleportation Circle. Slightly different as, of course, his Teleportation Circle can actually move larger objects. Since Thordak's body right here is dead, it's most likely perceived as an object, and actually the space in which you can take an object with teleportation is much smaller than the space in which you can teleport a object with teleportation circle. Teleportation circle says that the object has to be basically partially within the circle. As long as it's within the circle, it'll teleport. It does not actually have to be completely in the circle, while teleport says you specifically have to fit within the confines of the teleport. And so that's why I think it's the circle here. Obviously, she even made and drew a big circle for teleporting it, so taking that extra time, the artistic thing, the size restrictions, seems like it's teleportation circle to me. We see an example of the 5th level spell, telekinesis. She's lifting up and throwing these giant cubes at everyone. Right afterwards, she assembles them in place and creates a giant magical energy type barrier. As we know, usually when in doubt, if it's an energy barrier, it's the 5th level spell, Wall of Force. This right here appears to be the 6th level spell, Magic Jar, which basically is a spell that can let you hold your soul in it and then of course transfer your soul to a new body. She's obviously using the whole ziggurat as the jar basically in this scenario and transferring her soul to Thordak. We have an example of the 7th level spell, Teleport. Same thing. She has got a target group of 7 players plus herself, total a maximum of 8, and she's transporting to a location that she's already been before. Simple 7th level spell, Teleport. Right here we have an example of the 9th level spell, Meteor Swarm. Right here we have the Service Assembly. They cast a couple different spells. They have about 5 spellcasters or so back there that cast 5 independent balls of fire that hit and devastate a general area. They're 3rd level spell, Fireball. We have this spellcaster right here, 6th level spell, Chain Lightning. He releases several arcs of lightning that kind of stretch off and hit other additional people. And right here appears to be an example of the 6th level spell, Disintegrate. He releases a green necrotic beam, and as it hits the enemy, it literally vaporizes them into nothingness. Right here, of course, we have the Hand of Ord from Unkarel. They use several different magical items that have different features. This first one right here appears to be the 1st level spell, Alarm, which can be made into an audible sound. It's got, they added a little bit of extra little flair with little lighting effects and stuff like that. It's just a little bit of an artistic liberty, and of course it's coming from an item which kind of usually can break some of the confines of a spell's limitations. We see an example of possibly a 2nd level spell, Hold Person, as it entangles around the person and literally binds and holds them. So another way of expressing this spell, but through a magical item, which I think is pretty cool. We see an example of possibly what seems to be the 3rd level spell, Dispel Magic, as the armor actually is, of course, repelling off the grasping vine. However, there was armor actually in the campaign called Armor of Resistance that allows you to remake your saving throw. So what this could be is Armor of Resistance that they were using. It looks a lot like this armor actually right here in this picture. And when they had to make their save against the grapple feature right here, they could have just basically activated the armor to remake the save. And of course, then all of a sudden the vines broke off because they then made the save. So this could just be an example of the Armor of Resistance from campaign 1. We see an example of the 3rd level spell, Elemental Weapon, which adds elemental damage to your weapon that could be actually just basically ingrained in this magic item, so it always has access to the spell, or just in general, it's just a cool magical enchantment to the weapon, but it could be a spell feature. And right here we have an example of the 3rd level spell, Lightning Bolt. An example of it being targeted on an object and hitting and striking it down. This one right here, there actually was an amulet of Stone Golem, I think is what it's called. It allowed Keyleth, when she wore it, to control golems, which is interesting enough. So this might reference to the fact, instead of you wearing the amulet to control the stone golems, it turns you into a stone golem who obeys their master. The 9th level spell, Shape Change, actually could be imbued into this magical item for this particular reference. It can allow you to be turned into a different creature while still retaining some of your stats. And what's interesting is that little green orb right there is possibly a jade stone, and a jade stone is part of the casting requirements of Chain Shape. So possible fun little nod right there as well. Besides that, since it's a magical item, taking away their control and giving it to a different person as a deviation from how the spell works, because it does let you keep your intellect and stuff like that, is entirely acceptable, but was also a pretty hard spell to figure out in the season. That was all the spells of season 3 and ability features and item features that I was able to list off. There were, I think, a couple more that I might have missed, but there was a lot in the season, a lot more than I thought. Thank you guys for watching the video. Thank you guys for being so wonderful. Hopefully we'll get some more videos like this in the future. Definitely, of course, we got season 4 of Legend of Vox Machina and season 1 of the Mighty 9. Looking forward to that, hoping that that'll be a fun one to try out as well. Well, guys, until next time, thank you all again.